Good morning. For a long while, I've been fairly quiet on the Facebooks and all of that stuff, and that's in part because I've been kind of digging in and doing my grind. But I realized something the other day that kind of didn't sit well with me, which was that I realized I'm not very outspoken or even transparent about what my beliefs are from a spiritual standpoint. And being that those beliefs are Christian in nature, part of that is evangelizing and letting people know where you stand, so that they can consider, know, possibly shift over to what you believe is the truth. But with that in mind, I'm trying to be a bit more outspoken and also trying to be a bit more assertive in general, because I am kind of a mousy person. I know it doesn't look like it, but it's definitely true. So, with that in mind, taking a risk and speaking about something that is, in some regards, dangerous, but I mean, I'm in America, so I don't really have to care as much. Like, if I was in Israel or in Egypt or um, China or like the number of other places, I this wouldn't even be a thing that I could do without getting press ganged or shot, depending on where you're at. Now, Egypt, not so much. I mean, I lived there for 2 years, but I know things have kind of shifted a little bit in the past few years. A lot has happened in the world, but that's neither here nor there. The main thing I wanted to note is we'll start with a general introduction. I am what would be referred to as a non denominational Christian. I've been that for the entirety of my life. I've never actually found a denomination that I wanted to adhere to. So before we get into it, I have to define what a denomination is. So we'll break it down. Denomination is a conjugation of the word denominate, or rather denote, to be specific. And if we break it down, for instance, nominate would be in is more used in the political sense of selecting someone to elect, but the Latin base of nomi, that's name, essentially. And if we go back to denote, right? To denote something is to identify it, to state that this is this and that is that. To denote something is to set it aside and name it. And so, by stating that I am a non denominational Christian, I am essentially a Christian of the unnamed sect, which is a little bit weird when I put it that way, but it is what it is. So, with that in mind, why am I that? The long and short of it is that Christianity, in its original form, didn't have denominations per se. I mean, you could make the argument that there was the Judaism, and then what would become Christianity, with the apostles and Christ going around giving his message. However, even then, that's kind of a misnomer, because Judaism, the Jewish faith at the time, didn't really, and in some cases still doesn't really acknowledge Christ as the Savior. So, depending on who you're talking to, some will say that they're still waiting on him to appear. And I'm not going to purport to really fully know everything about the Jewish faith. However, Christianity started out as just it's the followers of Christ who believe that he died and rose again, died for our sins, broke the veil between God and man so that any person could essentially be their own priest, which is I know that's a very odd way of putting it, but that's essentially what it means is you don't have to have someone pray for you. You can pray yourself and be in communion with God um, just on your own. You don't have to have a tabernacle. You don't have to have a big temple. Um, you don't have to have an ancestral line, referring to the Levites, that is selected specifically to handle this stuff. And a number of things with regards to ritual and tradition were not necessarily rejected, but noted as perhaps unnecessary. Now, I say perhaps because there's a lot there's a lot to unpack there with regards to how Jesus interacted with specifically the Pharisees and the rest and the Jewish population writ large, and by that same token, the Gentiles, which is basically everyone else. Because again, you have this thing where Christ came and people were expecting a warrior, someone to overthrow the Roman occupation, and what they got was I am loath to say bleeding heart, um, because he had stones, if we're gonna put it simply. He was definitely the type of person that wouldn't take crap. If you look at how he talked to the Pharisees, oftentimes he would answer their questions with questions. He would force them to think on what they're saying, and he would often verbally trap them. He was a very, very strong wordsmith in that regard. And not to mention, there's the one instance, at least the one recorded instance of him becoming violent, which was specifically when the church was turned into a business, essentially. Because, going back to that whole deal of the temple, the tabernacle, you had to have people make sacrifices for you. And you would bring your first fruits out to the temple, have them consecrated, and then get them sacrificed. And they'd either be burned or cooked, and depending on the time period, the priests would then eat the food. It was actually their food. They weren't supposed. I know there were some specific things with regards to what the priests were supposed to do, and why it was necessary that they actually kind of had to eat what was presented. But I digress. The That incident where Christ got violent was specifically the temple was being used as a business because they were basically selling sacrificial items, and that defeats the point of the sacrifice because it's supposed to be of your things. It's supposed to be from you, a gift from you to God, an acknowledgement of the bounty that He has given you. You basically hand it back. You hand a portion of it back to Him and say, "Hey, thank you, I appreciate it." I mean, it's a very what's the word? very blasé way of putting it. That's essentially an aspect of it. I mean, if there's a lot more to it, but I'm not Jordan Peterson. I'm not even Mike Winger. I'm not going to go into that. If you want to look at exactly the role that sacrifices played back in the day and how that actually superimposes onto how we do things now, because there is actually an aspect of patterns of life that is kind of evoked in the way that works. But um, check out one of those guys. They'll have a lot more. They'll have um, they'll have it all figured out. But I digress. Point is, the Christian faith was a singular thing at the start, and as we got further away from the initiation, the 12 apostles, and the instantiation of churches around the world, um, they would deviate, understandably, because it's coming out and splitting across the places. And I think one of the most amazing things about it is that, for the fact that it has deviated and denominated into a bunch of different splits, the core elements of the doctrine have still stuck around this long. And I think due in no small part to the Bible, which is a miracle in of itself, not only for the fact that it's been compiled in the way that it has been, and the the way that it was compiled, the fact that it stuck around as long as it has, and that it is essentially the first book, the first really well traded book, and essentially kickstarted literacy in the modern civilized world, is kind of crazy when you think about it. But with all of that said, the denomination split, and it's because of different people's interpretations of what is necessary, what is not. Some groups kind of going back into the idea of, well, we need the traditions, we need the hierarchy, we need this, we need that. And to be sure, creating an amount of order surrounding the people that you're working with, that makes sense. But depending on which denomination you're looking at, each one, many of them have overindulgences or overstep their bounds in different ways. I mean, the most famous and immediate one that comes to mind is, well, I use the term indulgences, um, from the Catholic Church, and the whole creation of the Protestant sect, which is in of itself comprised of a great many subdivisions for this, that, and the other reason, due to people wanting to be able to do X and not having the ability to do X, and so they decided, well, I'm going to make a split of this religion because I believe in the base of this thing, but I want to be able to do X. X being one of those things, being divorce. If I remember correctly, that was one of I forget which denomination split off because of that particular thing, but I know that was one of the deals. But I digress. A lot of the denominational splits, if you go back to their initiations, may not necessarily have a biblical tenet to them. Now, I'm not going to say that that's true of all of them, but for the fact that I barely even have time to take care of myself, there's only a scant few things and I do a decent amount of study on X, Y, and Z, just to try and understand what's even being said in different scriptures and verses, and getting an understanding of things. I don't have as strong a base of which denomination is correct or not. And I mean, there's also an aspect of that the denominations themselves may not necessarily have to be right or wrong. They just have different traditions. Now, I'm not going to say that right and wrong doesn't exist. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that some of the splits when it comes to the creation of the denominations may have been more with regards to what humans wanted to be able to do rather than necessarily what scripture called for. At any rate, yeah, I am non-denominational Christian. Most Catholics would refer to me as Protestant because, well, it's been my understanding that in general Catholics refer to everything that isn't Catholic as Protestant, with maybe a few marked exceptions. It's been, at least that's how it's been described to me by those that I've known. But yeah, it is a thing when I look at some of the traditions, and I mean particularly in the Catholic space for sure, but um, even in other denominations, I will look at it and say, okay, you got that right. That makes sense. That's in the book. That's in the book. Where did this come from? Why are you doing that? Kind of thing. And so that's why I stay non-denominational. I don't actually ascribe myself to any particular specific denomination, in part to be true to my own cognizance of things, but also not to necessarily give credence to those individual denominations as being better than any of the others, unless I specifically identify an aspect within them that specifically says to me, yes, these guys have got it right, those guys have got it wrong, they're better. I mean, there's already enough other religions out there that I've chosen not to be a part of for various reasons, um, and have stuck to being a Christian. And I, creating, or rather building my reasoning for not being a part of those is hard enough as it is. Well, hard enough. I mean, it's simple for me, but explaining it in a way that makes sense, I guess. At any rate, and I've traveled on a little bit here, but the gist of it is, I am a non-denominational Christian. I do believe that God exists. Um, he's not a funny man in the sky, as a lot of people are wont to think that's what Christians believe. Um, the term that I use is, he is a manifestation of the very aspect of existence itself, which I can dig into exactly what that means at another time. But God as the manifestation of existence itself, um, Jesus Christ as a physical manifestation of him on earth, that he actually, as he stated in his ministry, um, he is the Son of God. And we get into some interesting stuff when we start talking about Trinity doctrine and the idea of them all being of one will, even though they are separate entities. It's a very nettled space, I will say. But yeah, I do believe that what Jesus said about himself is true, uh, and I do believe that he did rise from his grave, as some would say. There's plenty of literature with regards to historical accounts I mean, particularly there's historical accounts of his travels, of the apostles, of his different works, and of his death, um, with the from outside of the Jewish space, um, and outside of the Christian space, and then on the inside of it also, um, there is corroboration within some of the Hebrew texts and things of that nature. And I mean, the locations that are talked about actually do exist. The reason I know that is because I've been to them. So, I mean, there's that. So there's all of that thing, and I mean, there's also an aspect of it that is there is an aspect of it that is taken on faith, and I will not deny that. Um, that there is an aspect of it that is, I believe, not just because I believe, but because it makes sense to me. And perhaps I can dig into aspects of my belief in the existence of God, specifically as a manifestation of existence itself, um, at another time, because I have much clearer words to say on that one. I can say with it's a little bit more it's a little bit based on studies from other people, I will admit, when it comes to Jesus the Christ and believing that he was who he said he was. And it's also with interpretations of the Bible and the fact that the messianic there are many messianic, what would be the word, messages in the Old Testament that point towards Jesus appearing and point towards the specific events that transpire during his ministry, which is of importance. And then you get into that whole statement of, okay, well, what makes it so that everything that's in the Bible is true? Um, and that goes back to certain elements of. I mean, there's historical stuff because these are based off of Hebrew texts, um, and there's also that aspect of there are elements of accepted history that are based off of that take notes from biblical history, or rather, they're corroborated by what is stated in the Bible as true, which is an interesting thing in of itself. Now, that might come from the fact that the Bible was the first book, and I'll take that as you will, but I mean, there've been historians have existed before the Bible, for sure, before the Bible as a book. Um, and so that's the historical corroborations are, how would I put it, a little bit more. I would say they're more acceptable. It's a little bit more acceptable in that regard. Now, granted, I say these things in broad strokes, and it would be loath of me to make all of these grand statements and not explore them in some way, shape, or form. So that's something I'm going to try and do in the next while, is kind of dig into different statements about X, Y, and Z, state why I believe what I believe, on this, that, or the other thing. And I will admit, sometimes it will be just, well, I believe it because I believe it. That's just kind of how it goes. There's some aspects of my belief that is axiomatic in nature. In other words, it is, therefore I believe it. And there are certain elements of the very nature of reality that you kind of have to take axiomatically, such as I mean, the first one being reality is, in other words, reality exists, reality is real. That's per the nature of human perception. That is something that is not inherently provable. However, for you to be able to go through reality in a real sense and actually affect it and actually care about it in a way that allows you to live in it effectively, you kind of have to believe that it is real or at least has some effect on you. Because otherwise, there'd be no reason for you to continue living in some regards. I mean, if it's not real, then your whole goal would be to try and wake up from whatever dream you're in. And that's not a life that I want to live, personally. The implications of that kind of life are just not, seems a little, it's not quite nihilistic, but it does seem a little crazy. At any rate, I've jawed on here for quite some time. To go back to what I initially stated, I am a non-denominational Christian. I am that because I believe a lot of the sects that split off of original Christianity, a great deal of those splits are based on human misinterpretation or human reevaluation of things. Like some of the splits I do think are because of reevaluation of, hey, we've gone astray here, we need to get back, and all of that stuff. And so I just stick to saying I am just a Christian, not a Baptist, not a Protestant, not a Presbyterian, not a Mormon, uh, not a Jehovah's Witness, just a Gentile Christian trying to make his way through life. That's all for now.